Welcome, everybody. My name is Mina Jane, and I am the director of the Ashland Public Library. And I'm really excited to bring this program to you with Professor Christoph Strobel, talking about Native Americans of New England, their history, colonial legacies, and survival. Before I hand it over to Christoph, though, I just want to say a couple of things. One is that I'd like to thank the Friends of the Ashland Public Library who support all of our adult programming, or actually all of our programming. A little bit different from where I used to work. And I also want to say that we're doing this program in partnership with the Ashland Historical Society, the Ashland Community Center, and the Medway Public Library. And it's always really nice for me to partner with community organizations, because I feel like that is the best way to get the word out about these important and interesting programs. So thank you to the Historical Society, Community Center, and Library for joining us on this. So Christoph Strobel is a professor of history at the University of Massachusetts in Lowell, and he's the author of Native Americans of New England, the Global Atlantic 1400 to 1900, The Testing Grounds of Modern Empire, and co-author with Alice Nash of The Daily Life of Native Americans from Post-Columbian through 19th-Century America. I hosted Christoph a couple of years ago, actually, or maybe it was last year, at a different library, and well, you're in for a treat. That's all I'm going to say. So Christoph, I'm handing it over to you.
Yeah, with that advance warning, I'd be getting a drink and probably coffee, so I'd stay awake. Well, thank you very much, Mina, for having me, and thank you for the Friends for supporting this event and the library. If you are not a member of your local library's Friends, please consider joining up, because your membership fees support a lot of good things. So my talk today, sorry, I'm trying to get to the share screen. I'm a little bit, okay. So we are on share screen now, is that correct?
Correct.
Thank you, Mina. Boy, I did not miss this. All right. There we go. We should be on. Can everyone still, because I am flying blind now.
Oh no. Yeah, no, it's the presentation.
Okay. But it's not sharing yet.
It is sharing.
Okay, good. So I'm going to go into, and we're just going to stay this way. And I think with a setup, I'm just not going to be able to see faces, but we'll, Mina, if someone has a question, just chime in and let me know, and we'll wrap this up. Otherwise, I'm more than happy to stick around for questions later on. But so my talk today, and why I volunteer my time to talk at libraries and school, is to sort of create some awareness of the Indigenous history of the Commonwealth. I myself am not a Native American. I'm actually a fresh off the boat, I think is what they used to call it in the old days. But I've studied Indigenous history along with other subjects and taught courses on the subject matter. And I've always been fascinated with my students' interests on the subject matter, but also kind of how New England's history, Indigenous history, is a little bit different and has some facets and trends and tendencies that are very different from what I was used to from teaching a Native American. And so working on my last book was, and through the years teaching the subject matter to my students, has been kind of a great way to explore some history that I had been quite unaware of myself. And so that's why I kind of set out to write this book, but also why I'm doing these library talks, because I think it's an important part of our past. And so the way we tell this history and we remember this history is very much shaped by the colonial legacies. So the way we tell the story, we're going to explore tonight very much how this is shaped by colonial legacies. And the other part of our story tonight is, while some of what we're talking about is going to be an incredibly depressing story, is also important to emphasize the history of survival of Indigenous people as part of this history. And so we're kind of doing a two-way stream here tonight. We're going to talk about the colonial legacies and how they shape the view of how we see this Indigenous history. And we're also going to focus on the Indigenous survival in New England as an important part of the story. So this is the first colonial legacy. I want to talk and jump right in with the topic of excellent. So the chat is up. I can see it now. I'm going to move it a little bit to the side if it lets me. No, it doesn't. But you can always feel free to chime in with questions on the chat. I should be able to see them, although now it kind of shut me down again. So I might be flying blind here. So what I want to start out with today is the seal of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And it's been in the news as of late, or since January. Indigenous activists and academics like me have been talking about the seal and the problems it provides, and how it's maybe not the best representation of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. In fact, I happen to think that it's a pretty bad one. And through 2 decades of teaching students, and also through the library talks, I'm always sort of fascinated how little awareness there is about the state seal. But the state seal is kind of, for me, as one of those visible legacies of colonialism that are at the center of this talk. And so you look to as you look at your screen, on the left-hand side, you have the 17th century seal of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So you have that naked Native American in the seal, and out of his mouth comes a speech bubble, if you can read it, and it says, "Come over and help us." And so this is the root of the seal of Massachusetts. On the the left-hand side, I have a little bit of problems with my right and left, is the current seal of Massachusetts that might be abolished or might be redesigned soon. That process is ongoing, and we were supposed to have news on October 1st, but I think the committee that is doing this redesign, trying to develop the history, has only met once so far and has not met since then. But so let's look at the seal that is our contemporary seal. And on first glance, it looks kind of fine, right? The Native American is dressed. It seems a much more respectful representation. The speech bubble is gone. But when you look into the history of the design of the seal by a guy named Edmund Garrett, who designed this in the second half of the 19th century, he had very specific ideas in how he designed this Native American. He wanted to create an quote unquote ideal Indian in this image. And so you look at the body and the head, and this is kind of a Frankensteinian construction. So you have the body that is based on that of a archaeological find of an Indigenous person that was found in what is today Winthrop, Massachusetts. The head is actually the head of a 19th century Native American model from Montana. While there were Indigenous people in Massachusetts at the time, Garrett decided to go for someone that looked a little bit more Native American. People like Garrett and many other people in Massachusetts at the time felt that the Native Americans had ceased to be Native Americans. You hear a lot of the rhetoric. They might be the descendants of King Philip and Massasoit, but they are now no longer Native American. So the conception that Native people, like any other people, would change over time was very alien to mainstream New England society. And so this explains the head and the disjointed body. But then you look above the head and you have a sword flying over the head. And that's the sword of Miles Standish. As many of you in the audience probably know, he was the military commander of Plymouth Plantation. And in his first incursion, for example, with the Massachusetts Native people, he was part of a military engagement in which the head of a Native American was cut off and piked outside of Plymouth Plantation. You look at the belt in this image, and that is based on the belt of King Philip, which is a property of the Pequot Museum at Harvard University. King Philip himself too was decapitated after King Philip's War, and his head was piked also outside of Plymouth Plantation for 2 decades. It must have been quite a gruesome sight. The Sunk Squaw, or female leader, Weetamoo, who was also part of the indigenous resistance movement we today call King Philip's War, she was also decapitated. So there's a history of decapitating Native Americans, which makes the sword above the head of the Native American kind of offensive. And then you look at the seal, the motto of the state of Massachusetts: by the sword we seek peace. And I understand that this is sort of a revolutionary reference, but again, in the combination of the motto, the head body disjointed Native American, and Miles Standish's sword above the head, the seal in its current form is just not a very flattering representation of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. We also deal with a lot of intellectual legacies that come out sort of the colonial writers, and by that I of course mean Euro-American writers, New English writers of the 19th century, that have very much shaped our historic understanding of Native Americans, and they have really given very false representation of Native Americans. So the usual narratives of that New England was a quote unquote wilderness, was virgin land, was inhabited by nomads, it makes for good historic fiction, but it really is not an accurate representation of indigenous communities in New England and all of North America. So New England was a region of ecological stability. When you look at the early colonial records, the size of fish, the development of the region, agriculture, it was a very rich region, and the indigenous people had adapted to it in very sustainable ways. And in many ways, there's a lot we could learn from indigenous peoples about how to survive in the world sustainably. It was also a world of social complexity. Native Americans were not hunter-gatherers running around and roaming throughout New England, as some of the early writers suggested, but they were agriculturalists, they were farmers. Yes, Native Americans did not have domestic animals. Well, they had the dog and they domesticated the dogs. There were no cows, horses, chickens in the Americas at the time of the Columbian voyages. And therefore, they had to obtain proteins through the hunt and through fishing. But this is not like the kind of way of hunting that you like roam the woods for days, but rather it was based on a sophisticated system of land management, which was setting fires to the forest to burn down the undergrowth, which spurred the growth of grass, which attracted animal population and further animal populations. So in a sense, what we call Native American hunting is in many ways a free range pasture, just like Europeans manage the pastures for their domestic animals. Native Americans manage the forests for the animals that they would hunt. New England was tied into a sophisticated long distance exchange network that reached to New York, likely the Midwest, and we are looking at an indigenous history of over 10 millennia. There are, of course, the legacies of colonization and survival in the indigenous Northeast. And many of you in the audience are undoubtedly aware of the history of dispossession and the dismantling of community. But there is other elements here too that have a very dramatic impact on Native Americans. Yes. Sorry.
Go ahead. It sounded like somebody was on the phone.
Okay. All right. Sorry about that. So the disease, of course, most of the disease that we have as a human society come through our interaction with animals. Because Native Americans didn't have access to the same landscape of domesticatable animals as Afro-Eurasians had, so this is people of Africa, Europe, and Asia, the disease environment that developed in the Western Hemisphere was very different. So when European colonizers come over, and this is already before, say, the Mayflower in 1620, the interaction with fishermen, slave raiders, they also bring with them disease. And so there's already a massive depopulating impact in the 16th century through the Americas, which seems to escalate in the 17th century as more and more colonies take a foothold in the Western Hemisphere. So disease is one massive impact, along with the dispossession and the dismantling of community. The other story that is often not talked about in the history of colonization, and that's also very important, is that of slavery. I mentioned briefly the slave raiders, but that is a very prominent presence among early European sailors, people raiding for slaves. And you look at the famous Squanto, or Tisquantum, as he is often, which was his real name, but Squanto was a diminutive of his name. And so how did Squanto learn English, right? He was one of several people from his community that were captured in probably around 1614. He was brought to Spain. The plan was to sell him on the slave market. But then some Franciscans sprung him free through various ways. He made his way to England, ended up in the house of a rich investor, who then sent him back to an officer to explore and try to negotiate better terms of trades with native people in New England, who had been very reluctant to trade with the English because of the slave raiding. And in one of those interactions, Squanto was sprung free and was eventually returned to his homeland in what is today southeastern Massachusetts. So that is the history of slave raiding. But what we also often tend to forget in Massachusetts, that we are the first in many things in the United States. We are also the first colony, English-speaking colony, that is to create a system of slavery and put slavery on the books. Now, this happens again. The history of Native Americans is very central to that part of the story, and it's a story we historians are talking more and more about, and this is why I teach it in my classes. I deal with it in my research and writing, but I also mention this at talks like this. It's very important. Native people play a very important role in this history. There's this event called the Pequot War in the 1630s. And in many ways, the Puritans escalate this conflict. Even sort of an apologist like Professor Vaughn from Columbia University, who sort of tried to put a better face on the Pequot War. In the 1990s, he was like, I revisit the evidence, and this is really just a pretty bad setup by the Puritans. Along with Narragansett and Mohegan allies, they tried to undermine the position of the Pequot. And the Pequot had become sort of a prominent group grouping of people in villages and towns in southern Massachusetts because they had a strong position in the so-called wampum trade. And wampum are these little beads that are made out of shell. And I have like sort of a contemporary plastic version hanging here on my wall, which I'm holding down. This is actually was made by an Haudenosaunee friend of mine, a Seneca friend of mine. And so the wampum would be originally used for these types of beadwork, and they were over long distances. The colonists, the English colonists, used wampum as a currency until the 1650s because it was just more readily available than coins and so on. So wampum has power as a currency, and it has power as a currency or as a means of exchange in indigenous community. That's why the Puritans wanted to go after the Pequots, and their indigenous allies were trying to undermine the position of the Pequot to situate themselves in a better position. So this is in many raised the reasons why the Mohegan and the Narragansett participated on the side of the Puritans in this conflict. To make a long story and boring story short, it's an extremely bloody war. Many, many Pequots are killed. There is an entire Pequot village that is put on fire where over 500 people are massacred, most of them women, children, and elderly. As the war progresses, lots of other violence and smaller conflicts. As the war comes to an end, the English feel like the Pequot owe them, and they want to be compensated for the expenses they have incurred through this arduous and long conflict. And they take several hundred Pequot captive. They're brought back to Massachusetts Bay Colony. Some are worked as laborers on farms. Other Pequot are sold on the slave markets of the Atlantic world. And in exchange back, they're bringing in people of African descent. But there's also a conversation going on amongst New England intellectuals like Winthrop and others. It's like, okay, so the Romans took war captives, but they ended up calling them slaves. And so in this debate, New Englanders really have to try to come to terms of what to do with these Pequots, what to do with the Africans that they're bringing in exchange for Pequots that are sold. And in 1640, in the early 1640s, a few years after the Pequot War, Massachusetts Bay Colony is the first colony to put slavery on the books among the English-speaking colonies in mainland North America. So that is part of the story, the history of disease, the history of slavery, the history of dispossession of land, and the history of dismantling of community. And that is certainly several things that are still shaping contemporary indigenous communities. But there's also still indigenous communities around that have persisted despite this very gruesome history. So that's the other side of the story. There is adaptation amongst indigenous people. They show incredible resilience. And through all this history, they fight and struggle to maintain their sovereignty and independence. And they're really trying to keep their families together and their communities together. And that is also part of the history that we're going to explore. All right, so now I seem to be, okay, so that is that. So by the sword, we seek peace. The Commonwealth's motto. And again, I understand that I'm often told, yeah, but this is a revolutionary slogan. But because it's on the Massachusetts seal and the decapitated Native American, it also is, in a sense, it nicely embodies the history of warfare and colonization that helped to open up New England to Euro-American settlement. And war throughout the 17th and 18th century really played an incredibly important part of colonization. These were incredibly violent wars on both sides. And they reveal a lot about humanity, both the good and the bad. So that is maybe a good way to, instead of focusing on all these conflicts, and there are many, which is in a sense almost a talk of its own, is just a way to maybe focus in on King Philip's War, because it was the defining conflict, at least for Southern New England. So in the early 17th century, the indigenous population in New England was estimated to be about 140 to 120,000. And that's a low number, but let's keep in mind too that most English, like most European nation states, didn't have that large of a population. At this time, the global population is still far under 1 billion people. And most English towns and cities are about 2,000 to 4,000 people. In fact, Cahokia, the largest North American city in North America, is bigger than London, the biggest English city at the time. So yes. What does King Philip's War mean? Some historians have estimated that 7 out of 10 Native Americans were killed as a result of King Philip's War. And this also, of course, means people traded into Atlantic slavery, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And some historians say it's as much as 50%, whatever the exact numbers. King Philip's War is incredibly bloody. It's also often told sort of as a story of English colonists fighting Native Americans. And in fact, English colonists get a lot of help from Native American communities. For example, the Pequot in this conflict fight alongside the colonists, like the Mohegans. The Christian Indian communities in Massachusetts Bay Colony, often called the praying towns, most of them side with the New English in the conflict. But a couple of months in, after being engaged in several battles, Massachusetts Bay Colony decides to arrest several of the communities, most notably the largest community in Natick, which is the largest praying town and the most influential one. And they're brought into an internment camp on Deer Island. They're very poorly supplied, so people are starving en masse, and we don't really know how many people went on the island. We don't know how many people got off. You get a certain glimpse in the record every now and then that the mortality must have been quite dramatic. They're not allowed to cut trees. They're not allowed to like use as firewoods to build shelter. So anyone who's been on Deer Island, which is of course where today Boston sewage plant is, but very few signage to commemorate the internment camp of Native Americans on the island, which is changing now, but as everything, it's moving kind of slowly. People are starving, they're freezing to death. And several months out, Massachusetts comes to regret its decision to cut off its praying town Native Americans, because Connecticut, which very effectively uses Pequot and Mohegan allies, just experiences way less violence than, for example, Rhode Island, Plymouth, and Massachusetts Bay Colony. So Massachusetts officials go back on the island. They approach many of the male Native Americans that have survived so far. Will you join us in war? And the Praying Town Indians are desperate. They're hoping that this is a way for them to get off the island, but to also eventually get their wives and children off the island. And they join back into the service. When King Philip's War is over 1,000 Native Americans are sold into slavery in the Caribbean. Some of them allies of the New English. King Philip's War also spurs an outburst of an outward migration. So Many people, for example, I live up in the greater Lowell area. The communities up there, they dash up north, and most people don't come back. Or if they come back for quick stay. And in the 1680s, they head up to either the mission towns in Canada or to join Wabanaki communities or the Sokoke, the Wabanaki communities of northern New England, or the Sokoke in, as well as then other communities out in New York, upper New York State. The other thing here that you see on this picture is an image of Hannah Duston, the first statue built to a woman in the United States. Hannah Duston, of course, underscores another picture. When you're looking at the picture of what Hannah Duston is holding, it's a scalp. And we tend to think of like the history of, at least the way I grew up and the stories is scalping is something that Native Americans did. What we tend to forget is that from the 1670s through the 1750s, the Massachusetts Bay Colony passed over 60 scalp bounties. So the Massachusetts Bay Colony was in fact paying people to kill Native Americans and take off their hair and bring that in as an evidence for a kill that has been committed. And that is also part of our history of colonization and violence, and part of this very sad story. As war disappears, Native American, there is outward migration, there's a lot of death, but there's also Native American survival and persistence. Many indigenous New Englanders survive as slaves and as indentured servants on colonial farms and then later New English farms. Christianity also becomes a force, but it's not like in the 17th century where this was a process somewhat driven by missionaries, although in fairness, Praying Town Indians were very much in charge of running their own show. But by the 18th century and 19th century, Christianity becomes even more indigenized. You have missionaries like Samson Occam, or in the 19th century, you have the minister William Apis, who are very successful in converting Native Americans to Christianity, but they also become leaders in the community. So people like William Apis or Blind Joe Amos of Mashpee, they're not only ministers that serve their communities, but they also become political advocates. They fight for the rights of their communities. They are instrumental in educating Native American children how to read and write. And they look at education, just like Praying Town Indians in the 17th century. They look at education as a way to strengthen their communities. Native Americans have a strong presence in whaling. They work in agriculture, domestic labors. There is, when you read 19th century and 18th century accounts, there are stories about Indian peddlers and Indian doctors. Indian peddlers are people, for example, like broom makers, indigenous broom makers that then sell their brooms and other goods to white farmers. You have stories of Indian doctors, and this is the 19th century. Your chances of surviving going to a local healer or a person that knew about herbs was probably as high as going to a doctor. The medical profession in the 19th century does not have the best of reputation. And so Native Americans, because of their knowledge of herbs and plants, they show up throughout New England in our historic records as being present in that. You have also often doctors, they dress up as Native Americans and sort of the colonial stereotype of a Native American in order to sell their wares. It becomes a performative act, of course, that Native Americans feel like if they dress up in a certain way to fit Euro-American expectations, they end up selling more. So it's actually quite entrepreneurial. Native Americans work in construction, they work in the logging industry in northern New England. They're working in river driving, bringing the logs down the rivers. Tourism trades are very important in Indigenous communities, for example, in coastal New England. Canoe making with the Penobscot and Passamaquoddy are all very important parts of Indigenous survival in the 19th century and the way that Native Americans make a living and support their communities. The other thing I should have put on here is also Native Americans continue to serve in the military. And pretty much Southern New England Native Americans from the 18th century on, they fight first on the side of the English in the so-called French and Indian Wars, or in the Revolution, they fight on the side of the Americans. In the War of 1812, again, on the side of the Americans. So Native Americans don't only serve in whaling and construction and logging, but they're also an important part of the military structure. And a high proportion in their communities serves in the armed forces. Which brings us to the 19th century, because military service is very dangerous. Whaling is very dangerous. Horrible accidents can happen. You can get shot and killed. More often, you get disease and you die of that. What is happening in Indigenous societies starting in the 18th and the trend escalates in the 19th century is the male population, the female population declines, because that's the trend in Native American population in New England, but the male population declines much more dramatically. And so what ends up happening is that Indigenous women try to find and need to find partners outside of their communities, because there's just a shortage of men that they are able to marry to or have relationships with. So increasingly there is intermixing in Indigenous societies. And it's often the way that the father, who can be maybe African-American or a recent European immigrant, moves to the community. The children are still raised in the Native American communities. They're still raised in the culture. They just happen to have an immigrant father. And so that is why increasingly the perception among mainstream officials in New England is that, in Southern New England, is, well, our Native Americans, are they still reading Native American? Is this intermixing, diluting them as a people? And of course, these are sort of the notions of 19th century scientific racism, sort of this blood rule that was popularized by slavery, right? If you have a little bit of African-American blood, that makes you automatically African-American. And it's these kinds of perceptions that in the 19th century spur a lot of that kind of thinking. There's a lot of racism that Native Americans face. And what happens throughout the 18th and 19th century is that a lot of the smaller Indigenous communities are disappearing. And Native Americans are increasingly navigating to larger Indigenous reserves and settlements, or they're moving into urban areas. So Rhode Island, Providence, Rhode Island, for example, or Boston, Massachusetts are two cities where there's an increasing Indigenous presence. So, but it's also this perception amongst mainstream Americans or mainstream New Englanders that Native Americans have ceased to be Native Americans. And that becomes enforced increasingly by the from 1860 to 1880. That Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island are increasingly arguing, we are going to terminate these reserves and we're just gonna wipe them off the map. And so Native Americans are, of course, resisting this. They're saying, you can't take away our homes, you can't take away our communities, but these governments move ahead, and most, with the exception of a few smaller communities, most reserves are terminated between 1860 and 1880. But Native Americans resist this from the get-go. Even though communities are terminated, this doesn't mean that Indigenous communities cease. It's just that the state governments are saying, you guys are no longer Indigenous people. In fact, from termination on, Indigenous people always challenge these calls in the court. And the argument that Indigenous people make is, hey, don't we have a federal prerogative in American law? And it is only the federal government, not state governments, that can make decisions about Native people. And Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, they broke federal law when they terminated our community. And they go take this to the courts time and time again. And the courts always say, yeah, that is correct. Your interpretation is correct here. But there is what we lawyers call the colonial precedent. And the colonial precedent is such that, well, you lived in a place that was an English colony at once, so all those constitutional rights don't apply to you. This is a law that a judge challenges in the 1960s, and that has been sort of spurring the recognition or re-recognition at the federal level of many communities on the East Coast, including several of the New England communities. So that is one way that Native Americans fight this. They take it to the courts. Other ways are people are still gathering around the church. So the church still plays an important role in the survival of the community. You have people like Joseph Nicolar and others who write the history of their people. And his book, for example, is it's called The Life and Traditions of the Red Men. It was written in the 19th century. It's a very, it's just a very good book. And it's like, it's hard to believe, wow, this is a person that wrote this in the 19th century. It has so many understandings and depictions. It's a book ahead of its time. Gladys Tantaquidgeon, who you see on this picture, she was a Mohegan Native American, lived to the proud age of over 100. She was trained as a traditional healer throughout her childhood. Then she took a more traditional training, went to college, eventually gained a PhD from the University of Pennsylvania in anthropology. She worked in various, in the FDR administration in various areas relating to Native American issues. But throughout her lifetime too, she spent a lot of time with family members, collecting artifacts, documents, and all kinds of other evidence on the history of the Mohegan people. That evidence is now in a museum on the Mohegan Reservation, and it's called the Tantiquidgeon Museum after Gladys and her family. But this evidence was also used by the Mohegan to make the claim for federal recognition. So when the tides of the court started to turn, people on the Mohegan Reservation used the evidence that Tantiquidgeon and her family had collected to make the argument. We have always been Mohegans. We never cease to be Mohegans. We need to be, the state of Connecticut violated federal law when they took away our status as an Indigenous nation, and we need to be reinstated. And eventually, various groups won in this area. The Narragansett, the Mohegan, two of the Pequot nations, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Legacies of colonization. We also have, of course, in New England, the history of the boarding and residential schools. Many of the young Native Americans in the 19th and 20th century ended up in either federal schools or religiously run schools. And when you talk to boarding school survivors, it is a very sad experience because the boarding schools were places of tremendous abuse, sexual violence, and physical abuse, emotional abuse, and these people were scarred for life. You could get beaten up, sent into solitary confinement for things like speaking in your own native language. And so boarding school survivors often stopped teaching their own children their language. Of course, the other part of this history, which is connected, is that of family separation. The other thing that Native Americans had to always be fearful for is not only that their kids would be sent to a boarding school, taken away and sent away to a boarding school. In a sense, I mean, I hate to put it in those terms, but it's almost a hostage situation. It's not almost. In fact, the whole point of the boarding schools is to take the children of Great Plains nations and take them away from people so they wouldn't resist militarily and put them in schools on the East Coast to make sure that they wouldn't resist. And then Native people from other parts of the country were put into these schools as well. The issue of family separation happens throughout the 20th century, that Native Americans often get their children taken away. And it's often very clearly when you study the history of individual families and people, the reason why their kids were taken away wasn't because they were bad parents or wasn't because they didn't take care of their children, but it becomes very clear that placing them with white families many social workers believed that they could, as they say with a boarding school, kill the Indian, quote unquote, to save the man. That was sort of the mindset at the time. And what's happening in the state of Maine is that this story continues. So family separation in the United States was outlawed in the 1970s. But what ended up happening in the state of Maine is it miraculously continued into the 2000s. And it's a big issue there in Maine. There was a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. If you folks are familiar with the documentary Dawnland, it deals with this issue. I think you can still find it until November 20th. I think it's still going to be available on PBS. So if you want to, I would encourage you to check it out. And so that's a very depressing story. And so Maine is trying to come up with these issues. Yes, and Mina put it on the chat, Dawnland on PBS. And the people who made this film are actually right from Boston, and they have another interesting movie coming up on New England history. So we already talked about state and federal recognition and how the laws, and I kind of want to wrap things up because I'm getting on talking for 50 minutes, and that's more than I should be talking. What happens too, sort of with this process of fighting for federal and state recognition, in the 20th century, you have a growth of indigenous nationalism and attempts to establish sovereignty. But there's also a lot of Native American activism. We're at now over 50 years of a yearly protest every Thanksgiving at Plymouth Rock. But there is really protests of this kind that are staged all over New England to commemorate various things. For example, there was a protest a few years ago to kind of commemorate the history of Deer Island and the incarceration of the Praying Town Indians. Economic and cultural revitalization remains a central issue to Indigenous communities. How do you guarantee the economic survival of your community in often depressed areas? And sort of like the Penobscot and the Passamaquoddy especially have come up with some interesting economic developmental programs. Some work quite well, some not so much. COVID has certainly been a tough haul for many Indigenous communities, and the opioid crisis, which we kind of don't talk about as much anymore because of COVID, but which certainly continues to be a force. Again, COVID and opioid impact mainstream society to a very hard degree, but the numbers in Indigenous societies are even higher. Language preservation, the Wampanoag language preservation program, for example, at Mashpee is sort of a way in which Native Americans are trying to preserve their languages. Again, the history of family separation, the history of boarding schools, the history of being a very tiny minority in an often inconsiderate mainstream culture has certainly made the loss of language a big issue throughout the United States for Native Americans, but has certainly been much more of a challenge for Indigenous communities. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now because I have really talked enough, and I want to, yeah, so 50 minutes. I wanted to settle with 45, so I went like 5 minutes over, sorry. But I'm happy if you want to turn on your camera. You don't have to, as I always tell my students, but I am looking to answer questions, further discussion, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I just said to people that they can put it in a chat, or you can unmute yourself. And if I see you unmuted, I'll call on you. Christoph,
and you even found the link to awesome.
Librarian. I do have a question about this, not necessarily what you were just talking about, but what drew you to researching this particular subject with so many social justice issues out there that people are interested in? What was it about this?
Oh, that is a complicated story. So I came to this country when I was 18, 19, and I met a friend who was Seneca. And so I spent a lot of time with her on the reservation, in the Allegheny Reservation in Western New York. And so when I came to graduate school, I studied a lot of colonial Indigenous white relations, but I also started teaching a course, and yeah, and sort of kind of fell into it. And when I moved to Lowell, teaching the Native American Survey course, having students ask questions about New England, and me realizing increasingly, like this termination thing, that is like very unique to Massachusetts. The slavery piece is very unique to the East Coast. And that's why I ended up doing more and more research and worked on that book. So, but that's kind of like a long, almost 30-year history at this point of how this came about.
Mm-hmm. I'm not getting any questions yet from the attendees, so I'm just going to keep going.
I've put them all to sleep.
I don't think so. I'm fascinated. What did you think about the story from Canada around that residential school, because you had just said just a minute ago that, you know, it seemed unique to the East Coast, but yet it was happening in other places.
Oh no, the boarding school is not. What's unique to the East Coast is that, for example, a family separation, even though the Congress said it's illegal, the state of Maine went guns blazing ahead and did it for another 20 years. And now they're in a big mess, and the repercussions of that. And if you watch Dawnland, it's just, I mean, it's hard not to be moved to tears by that. Mm-hmm. No, I mean, I think Canada is like maybe a step ahead of us in that they're like now starting to uncover this. We'll see what happens in the United States. I mean, the Canadians have also crunched the numbers. It was actually your survival chances of being a soldier on the European front lines in World War I. Your survival chances were higher than being a child in one of these, what the Canadians call a residential school. So these were extremely deadly places. We kind of always knew this, and now with these digs that are like looking at unmarked graves, we're finding out a lot. And I would assume that we would do the same in the United States. We probably would find a lot more. And as with everything regarding history, it's not. So there's a lot of, to Andre's question, are there known local examples? Yeah, we actually, in New England, maybe invented the boarding school. So first, I mean, Dartmouth College, in a sense, Harvard College had an Indian college. So there's no federal boarding school in New England. The closest one is Carlisle, and there were certainly some kids sent to those. And then there's religious schools. There were some state schools in New York. There were also residential schools that have an incredibly violent history. I think there's a documentary about that too. I think it is called Unseen Tears, which deals with that subject as well.
Okay. Just sad. So what about, I saw another documentary on Canopy about, it was like a series of 3 or 4 short films about the history of the Indigenous people, and I'm gonna hold off on my question because I see that Sean has unmuted himself.
Excellent, Sean.
Hi, Professor Strobel. Thank you for your presentation. It's an excellent job. So I have a particular interest in sort of the local praying town of Mogongo and Ashland, and as well as the local Indigenous tribe, the Nipmuc tribe. I'm curious, how do you go about researching pre-colonial history and culture of these people, given that most of the historical record comes from European explorers and missionaries, that their native language is lost, it's gone, as is their oral tradition? How do you piece together that history?
It's very hard, especially then when you're trying to do these micro histories. I deal with this in my current book, and what I talk about a lot, and I have done some micro histories up with the Wamasee community, which is another praying town up in Lowell. And what I end up working about and talking about is mostly sort of the problems that you are exactly talking about. How do colonists deal with this, and sort of what are their biases? And then also, how have these stories been told by people since colonial times? And so, yeah, that in itself is a fascinating story. And it's in a sense, you're absolutely correct. I mean, you can look at the archaeological record, you can try to find as much oral historical record you can, and then you're trying to look at the early colonial records, and you kind of see okay, this guy is clearly a political hack.
Right.
And then there's other, like Roger Williams, he has his biases, but you can see, okay. And there's this guy named William Wood who wrote this very short book in the 1630s, but he's kind of like a guy, he's no BS. And I mean, there is wrong information in the book that he just didn't grasp or get, but he is just a very unpure, I mean, he's clearly not a Puritan because he doesn't have any of these hang-ups with salvation and blah, blah, blah. And so you sift through a lot of very limited sources and archaeology, and you try to piece this together. And what I always think is also very much how we learn about our own legacies and biases in the way we tell this history.
Would you say that some of the other local tribes, and maybe some of the tribes from northern New England that weren't as decimated in the 1600s, does their culture and their history mirror somewhat of sort of the central Massachusetts Blackstone Valley tribes like the Nipmucs or the Massasoits? Can you? I know that they come from an Algonquin tradition. So is their history and language somewhat close? Can you piece those pieces together?
Yeah, there are linguistic relations, and so they're all part of the same language group. Mm-hmm. And sort of there is similarities, language, and people use sort of the Eliot dictionary and Eliot Bible, which, I mean, we call it Eliot, but what we tend to forget is these praying town Indians were very well educated, and most of this work wasn't done by Eliot, but they were done by Native Americans. And sort of the Wampanoag Reclamation Project, I mean, there's a linguist at MIT and community members in the 70s and 80s that sort of used these sources and then recreated the Wampanoag language to sort of and now it's a well-run school, and there are a ton of children in Mashpee that are speaking Wampanoag.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you so much.
And so, yes, and so with the Passamaquoddy Penobscot, there is more depth there, and there just isn't quite that like destructive history there. But again, the friend that I referenced earlier, she runs she's a Seneca language teacher now, and so you have a lot of people in communities all over North America that could have had very lucrative careers in other areas, and they've sort of made it their mission for language revitalization. And to me, they are one of the biggest heroes of contemporary Native America, because they are doing so much to try to revitalize their language, to strengthen the language in their communities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
I really appreciate your answer. Thank you.
I used to work at the Bacon Free Library in Natick, and it was above the Historical Society, and they have an original Eliot Bible. So that's really interesting to get the perspective on that. Jean asks, says, I'm not familiar with the Deer Island internment camp. Are there any books, articles, or documentaries you would recommend on that?
There's very little information on that. It's really like Gookin wrote a little bit about it, but not much. And Gookin was, along Eliot, was sort of one of the two leading New Englanders. Yeah, it's a very sad history, and they're supposed to be putting a marker up there now. And I haven't been on Deer Island for a while, but I think it's all of this stuff is really slow moving. And yes, no, so there's very little, like a paragraph here and there in books, and because the information is just not available.
That's too bad. So I was asking earlier, and maybe that can be our last question, was I'd seen a series of short documentaries on Canopy. If you have a library card, you can access them. They're really good. And they talk about how the Native Americans originally, like now our form of government is based on a Native American concept. And many things that we do now are based on Native American concepts. Is there any opportunity for the Native Americans to sort of claim that?
Well, yeah, and then there's historians, not like me, but part of my guild, that are sort of busting that, what they call busting a myth. So I think that it's a very contentious issue among historians, because they're sort of like thinking the connections are very loose. But in all fairness, Benjamin Franklin spent a lot of time among the Haudenosaunee, and so it can't just be that has influenced him. Also, there's a lot of European scholars, sort of the fathers of the Enlightenment, that very intrinsically studied indigenous societies, often through book knowledge and so on. So yes, I mean, it is very much invested in that. Most Native people that I know, they are more into contemporary questions. It's like, how do we revitalize our languages? How do we help our communities survive COVID? What is it that we can do about the opioid crisis? How can we overcome the legacies of the boarding schools and family separation, which seem to, again, spur the opioid crisis and all that stuff? And when you look at a post-traumatic society like that, there's all these issues. And so in my experience, while there's fortunately now a growing number of indigenous scholars that have emerged and are becoming more and more active, and they're dealing with issues of the past and literature, that is still, in my opinion, understandably a big focus that people really want to like change things now, instead of dwelling on a very horrible past that they understand and know quite well, without having a PhD in history.
Yeah. Actually, you mentioned something that if you don't mind me asking one more short question, is what do you think about the fact that the Native population was one of the first and most inclusive in getting the COVID vaccine?
Can you rephrase that question again? Sorry.
Just, I've read that the Native populations actually got vaccinated, high percentages of those groups. And I think that that's interesting given, how it's been kind of a slow movement.
Yeah, I think there is some, I think that is probably true for a lot of communities, but then other communities is not. And then, yeah, so a lot of information I have, of course, is pre-vaccination, but I saw some studies now looking at the Navajos, for example, where COVID is still having an impact. And I'm not entirely sure if this is people that haven't vaccinated, but they have just been in vulnerable groups, et cetera, et cetera. And so, yeah. And it wouldn't surprise me because, I mean, Indigenous people have had a long and sad history of interaction with disease. And so that they would be more likely to embrace a vaccine makes perfect sense.
Thank you. So I'm not seeing any more questions. So I just want to say thank you for this really, really fascinating conversation. I heard some of it last time when you spoke, and it seems all new to me. So really, thank you. And
thank you all for making it out on such a wretched night.
That's right. So we had to turn virtual today, but I do appreciate everybody who's here. And again, I'd like to thank, the Historical Society, the Community Center, and the Medway Library for supporting this program, and for Christoph for all of your knowledge and sharing. I know it's a really busy time for you, so I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. And stay well, everyone, and be healthy, and all the best to everyone. Take care.
Thank you. Bye, everybody. Good night.
Bye. Have a good night.